They didn't even tell her the truth about where she was going. That's the part that gets me every single time I think about it. They sat her down at that kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten 10,000 quiet meals, the same table where she had folded laundry while her sisters talked about their lives like she wasn't in the room, and they handed her a piece of paper. And her father, the man who was supposed to love her more than anyone on this earth, could not look her in the eye when he slid it across the wood. And Genevieve Cole did not cry. She didn't beg. She didn't flip the table. She didn't ask the question burning a hole in her chest, which was, why is it always me? She just picked up the pen. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal, and I want you to answer in the comments right now. Has someone you loved ever made a decision about your life without asking you first? Tell me below, because this story is about to make that hit different. The contract was 2 pages. Legal language. Official seals. The kind of document that takes something human and turns it into a transaction. She read every word, because that's who Genevieve was: careful, thorough, precise. The girl who checked twice because no one else was checking for her. And when she got to the bottom and read the name printed there, Dominic Vale, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, Sovereign of the Ashford Range, her hand went completely still. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. You didn't grow up within 300 miles of the Northern Pack and not know what Dominic Vale was. You didn't live in a house with windows that faced north and not feel, on certain nights, something moved through the air that made every dog in the county go quiet. He wasn't a story parents told to scare children. He was the reason the stories existed in the first place. And her father had just signed her over to his household. As a servante, she looked up from the paper. Her eldest sister, Cassidy, was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at the ceiling. Her younger sister, Bryn, had already left the room. Her father had his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the wall behind her head. Nobody would look at her. Not one person in that room could hold her gaze for what they had just done. And that silence, that specific, cowardly silence, told her everything she needed to know about how much she had ever mattered to them. She signed the contract. She pressed the pen down hard. Slow, clean strokes. Her name in full. Genevieve Marie Cole. Like she was signing something that belonged to her. Like this was her choice, not their disposal. She handed it back. She pushed her chair back from the table. She went upstairs. She packed the one bag she owned, the brown canvas one, with the broken zipper she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she let herself have exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes to feel it, the sting of it, the weight of it, the particular devastating grief of being given away by people who were supposed to keep you. Then she stood up, because Genevieve Cole had survived every single thing this family had thrown at her, and she was not about to fall apart now. Not for them, not in this house, not tonight. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting on that bed in the dark, was that 200 miles north, in a house made of black stone and old power, something had shifted. A man who hadn't felt anything in 7 years had looked up from his desk at nothing in particular, and gone very, very still, like something was coming, like something had already begun. She was in the transport cart by 5 the next morning, before her sisters were even awake. Nobody came to say goodbye. The driver was an older man, stocky, with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had seen too much, and decided to stop reacting to any of it. He helped her lift her bag. He didn't say a word. She sat on the wooden bench in the back of the cart, with her hands folded in her lap, and the cold morning air moving through her hair, and she watched her childhood home get smaller and smaller, until it disappeared behind a turn in the S road. She didn't look away until it was completely gone, and even then she kept her face forward, jaw set, eyes dry. The road north was 3 hours through territory that got wilder and quieter the further they went. The trees changed first. They got taller, darker, closer together, like they were crowding in on something. Then the light changed. Even on a clear morning, the sky above the northern woods had a quality to it, a particular shade of pale gray that didn't feel like overcast. It felt like held breath, like the whole landscape was waiting for permission to exhale. She pressed her hands between her knees to stop them from shaking. She was not afraid. She told herself that firmly. She was not afraid. She was practical. She was capable. She had kept a household running since she was 14 years old. She could clean anything, manage anything, endure anything. She had the kind of competence that comes not from ambition but from survival. Whatever this estate needed from her, she could provide it. She would put her head down. She would do the work. She would be invisible and useful and untouchable. And eventually, She would find a way out of this that was on her own terms. That was the plan. That was always the plan. She was halfway through mentally organizing her plan when the estate appeared, and the plan dissolved, because nothing, not the stories, not the whispers, not the name on the contract, had prepared her for this. The walls rose out of the landscape like they had always been there, like they had grown up from the rock itself. Black granite, quarried from the mountain before anyone alive had been born, towers that disappeared into the low morning cloud. Iron gates so tall she had to tilt her head back to see the top of them. Fitted with a crest, she recognized a wolf, mid-leap, carved in relief, mouth open, every detail preserved in metal so old it had turned the color of a deep bruise. The cart slowed. The driver said the only words he would say the entire journey. "Don't touch the gates." She pulled her hands into her lap. The gates opened on their own. No guard she could see. No mechanism she could hear. They simply swung inward, slowly and silently, and with the kind of certainty that said these gates had never once opened for someone who wasn't meant to enter, and they had never once failed to open for someone who was. She rode through, and the moment she passed beneath that iron arch, something happened. It was not dramatic. There was no sound, no flash, no physical sensation she could put words to. It was more like a pressure change, like walking from one room into another. Except the room she had just walked into was older than anything she had ever touched. Older than the stone. Older than the name carved above the gate. Like the land itself had a memory, and it was looking at her, and deciding what to do with what it recognized. She dismissed the thought immediately. She was tired. She was cold. She was reading meaning into architecture, because the alternative was sitting with how terrified she actually was. She was terrified. There. She admitted it. To herself, alone, in the back of a cart on the wrong side of an iron gate. She was afraid. She had every right to be afraid. She had been signed over to the household of a man who hadn't smiled in 7 years, and whose wolves had never once let someone leave who wasn't supposed to. But fear and forward motion are not mutually exclusive. She had learned that the hard way. She picked up her bag. The cart stopped at the base of wide stone steps. A woman was already waiting at the top. Tall, dark-coated, silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be holding her face in place. She had the posture of someone who had spent decades being the most competent person in every room and had long since stopped expecting acknowledgement for it. Her eyes moved over Genevieve exactly once. Quick, clinical, measuring. "You're the Cole girl," she said. "I am. I'm Mrs. Harlan, head of household." She turned and walked toward the entrance without waiting. "You'll follow me." Genevieve followed. The entry hall was the size of her entire childhood home. Stone floors polished to a low shine. Ceilings lost in shadow. Corridors that branched in 3 directions and disappeared into the dark. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, real fire, not electric. And the light they threw was amber and unsteady, and made everything look like it was slightly breathing. Mrs. Harlan walked and talked in the clipped, efficient rhythm of someone reciting a list they had memorized and did not intend to repeat. East corridor, her quarters. Dawn when her shift began. 3 meals a day, taken with staff. No personal guests. No wandering after 10. No speaking to the alpha unless directly addressed. She nodded at all of it. "And the West Wing," Mrs. Harlan said, and here her pace slowed by exactly half a step, so brief Genevieve almost missed it, "is off limits." Off limits. Completely. For any reason. Under any circumstance. She did not turn around. "If you find yourself near the West Corridor, you have made a wrong turn. Correct it immediately and do not go back." Genevieve kept her voice even. "Understood." Mrs. Harlan stopped at a door in the East Corridor. Opened it. Small room. Single bed. Narrow window. A fireplace that was not lit. "You'll want to sleep," she said. "Morning comes early here." She left without looking back. Genevieve set her bag on the bed. She sat beside it. She looked at the cold fireplace for a long time. She looked at the narrow window. Through it, she could see one tower of the estate rising against the sky. A single light burning at its highest point. Yellow-white. Steady. Someone was up there. At this hour. In that tower. She didn't know how she knew it was him. She didn't know how she knew he was awake. But she knew. The same way she'd known the moment her father slid that contract across the table that something was very, very wrong. She laid down on the bed with her coat still on. She stared at the ceiling. And for the first time since she'd signed her name on 2 pages of her own life and handed it to a stranger, She asked herself the question she had been avoiding since the kitchen table. What if the thing waiting for her on the other side of this contract wasn't punishment? What if it was something she didn't have a word for yet? She closed her eyes, and across the estate, in the tower with the yellow-white light burning, a man set down his pen and turned his face toward the east corridor, and breathed, like something had just arrived that he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. She was scrubbing the hallway floor at 6:15 in the morning when she heard the doors open at the far end of the corridor. She didn't look up. She had been a servant in this estate for exactly 37 hours, and she had already learned two things that nobody had told her directly. The first was that the staff did not look up when they heard those doors. The second was that there was a very specific quality to the air in the moments before Dominic Vale entered a room. A drop in temperature, a tightening, like the space itself was adjusting to accommodate something too large for ordinary atmosphere. And if you paid attention, you felt it coming before you heard it. She paid attention to everything. She pressed the brush to the stone and kept her strokes even. His footsteps were not loud. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected something heavy and deliberate, the walk of a man who had never in his life needed to announce himself, because his presence did it for him. And it did. But his actual footsteps were measured and controlled, each one placed with a precision that spoke not of effort, but of discipline so deeply embedded it had become instinct. He was going to pass her. She knew that. She was staff. She was on the floor with a brush in her hand, and her hair pinned back, and her plainest work clothes on. She was as invisible as a person could make themselves, which was exactly the point, which was exactly what she needed to be. He stopped. She felt it before she registered it consciously. The footsteps ceased, and the air did something she couldn't categorize, and the back of her neck went warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She kept her eyes on the floor. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. She could feel his gaze the way you feel. Direct sunlight not seen, just felt, pressing against the side of her face with a weight that had no business belonging to a look. She looked up, and that was when she understood why no one in this estate looked up when those doors opened. Because once you looked, once you made that mistake, looking away again became a problem. Dominic Vale stood 10 feet from her in a black coat, dark trousers, no armor, nothing ceremonial. He was not dressed like a king this morning. He was dressed like a man who had been awake for a very long time and had somewhere important to be. But the absence of ceremony did not make him less. It made him more. Like seeing a storm without the clouds. Just the electricity, just the pressure, just the thing itself. He was looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her. At her. With a focus so absolute that everything else in the corridor seemed to blur slightly at the edges. Like reality itself was deciding he was the only thing worth rendering in full detail. His jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough. He inhaled. She saw it. The chest expand, a second longer than breathing required. Controlled. Like he was doing it on purpose. Like he had caught something in the air and needed to be certain of what it was. Then his eyes moved across her face, not a sweep, each part separately, like he was cataloging and landed back on her eyes. She did not look away. She didn't know why she didn't look away. Every piece of training, every instinct honed by 22 years of learning how to make herself small and unthreatening and forgettable. All of it said, lower your gaze. All of it said, you are the servant, he is the king. Look at the floor. She looked right back at him. Something moved through his expression. Fast, gone before she could name it. But it was there. You're the new one, he said. His voice was low, even, and completely devoid of affect, the voice of someone who had learned to take every variable out of their tone, so that nothing could be read into it that wasn't meant to be there. But she had spent her whole life learning to listen to what people were not saying. And underneath the control, underneath the flatness, there was something. Yes, she said. Genevieve Cole. He said nothing for a moment. You were looking at the floor, he said. I was cleaning it. Another pause. And now you're looking at me. You stopped walking. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. A fractional shift, the way a fault line moves imperceptible on the surface, significant underneath. Stay out of my way, he said, and he walked past her. She turned back to the floor and pressed the brush to the stone and told her hands to stop shaking. They didn't listen. But here is the thing nobody tells you about moments like that one. The moment didn't end when he walked away. The moment kept going. It lived in the residue he left in the air, in the warmth still pressed against the side of her face where his gaze had been. in the way her pulse was doing something completely unacceptable for a girl scrubbing floors at 6:15 in the morning. She worked until her shoulders ached. She worked until the corridor was clean enough to eat off. She worked until she was too His grip was crushing and his hand was shaking and his temperature was extraordinary. She could feel the heat of him through her sleeve. Fever heat, controlled burn heat, the heat of something fighting itself from the inside. She did not pull away. She pressed her other hand over his. "Breathe," she said. Her voice was steady. She had no idea how her voice was steady. "Match mine. Just breathe." She breathed in slowly, held it, let it out. His chest stuttered. She did it again. In, hold, out. He was watching her face with those gold eyes, and the gold was at war with something underneath it. The brown trying to come back. The man trying to resurface from whatever depth he'd gone to. And she held his gaze and she breathed. And she did not look away, even when the grip on her wrist got tighter. Even when the sound from his chest got louder for one terrible second before it began. Slowly, to ease. The fur receded. It happened in stages. The forearms first, then the spine. Then the hands she felt the moment his fingers returned to fingers, felt the exact second the grip became human again. Not gentler necessarily, but different. The difference between caught and held. The temperature dropped. Not all at once, like a tide going out. His breathing changed. In, hold, out. He was matching her. She didn't know when that had started. But he was. The gold in his eyes was pulling back, the brown coming in at the edges, slowly taking the room back from the animal that had been occupying it. And then they were just two people. In a bare stone room in the west wing at 4 a.m, his forehead dropped toward her shoulder. He didn't touch her. He hovered, like he was making himself stop. Like stopping was costing him something. She could feel the heat of his face half an inch from her collarbone. She did not move. She did not breathe. "You should not be here," he said. Rough, broken at the edges. The voice of a man reassembling himself word by word. "I know," she said. Silence. She could hear the torches in the corridor. She could hear the wind outside the estate walls. She could hear her own pulse doing something completely ridiculous. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. "Long enough." Another silence, different from the first, denser. "You weren't afraid." It was not a question. More like something he was working out. She considered lying. She decided against it. "I was afraid," she said. "I came anyway." He lifted his head. He was close. Too close for what they were to each other. Too close for the contract and the title and the corridor and everything else that said there was supposed to be a clear line between them. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were brown again, fully brown, and she could see the exhaustion in them, deep, structural exhaustion, the kind that came not from one bad night, but from years of holding something back, and underneath the exhaustion, something else that she did not have a name for, and was not ready to look at directly. "You can't tell anyone what you saw," he said. "I know." He looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that wasn't about seeing anymore, but about something else entirely. "Go back to your room, Genevieve." She stood. She crossed the room. She reached the doorway. She stopped. She did not turn around. "For the record," she said, to the stone in front of her, "the cuff is still on the floor." A pause. "I know," he said. "You should pick it up." Another pause. "I will." She walked back down the west corridor, back through the dark and the different dark and the smell of old forest, back to the east wing, back to her room, back to her bed. She lay on her back. The fire was burning. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, and she had the very clear and very inconvenient thought that Dominic Vale Alpha King, sovereign, controlled, dangerous, off limits in every sense of the word, had just looked at her like she was the only solid thing in the room, like she was the only real thing, and she did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with any of this, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lying in that bed at 4 a.m, with the fire he had lit burning beside her, and the warmth of his hand still in her palm, something had just changed between them, something that did not have an undo. And somewhere across the estate, she was almost certain, he was still awake, still sitting in that bare stone room, still thinking about the exact same thing she was. And that was the most dangerous thought she'd had since she walked through those iron gates, because dangerous things, she was beginning to understand, had a way of feeling exactly like the thing you'd been waiting for your whole life.
Not because she was difficult. She was the opposite of difficult. She was competent and quiet and asked exactly the questions she needed to ask, and none of the ones she didn't. She learned the estate's administrative systems in 48 hours. She organized the correspondence backlog in a way that would have taken my previous assistant 3 weeks. She did not require direction, and she did not require approval, and she moved through the work with a self-contained efficiency that should have made her easy to ignore. It made her impossible to ignore. Because efficiency was common, I hired capable people. What was not common, what I had not encountered in a very long time, was someone who did all of it without performing it. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She wasn't trying to impress me. She was just doing the work because the work was there and she was the one doing it. And my wolf, who had been silent for the better part of a decade, was paying very close attention. I caught it on the third day. The tracking. I had started monitoring her position in the room the way I monitored everything automatically, without deciding to. The way you breathe or blink. And when I caught myself doing it, I did not stop. I just noted it and kept doing it and told myself it was standard situational awareness, and that was a lie I did not entirely believe but maintained anyway because the alternative, admitting what it actually was not something I was ready for. On the fourth day, she smiled at something she read. Small. Private. Not for anyone. Just her. And whatever was in the document. And a moment of quiet amusement she probably didn't know was visible. I read the same paragraph of the territory agreement 11 times. Something had to give. It gave on Friday afternoon. The Eastern delegate came in a young wolf named Ren Carter from the Callaway Pack, sent to discuss the border adjustment negotiations. He was professional and prepared, and approximately 10 years too comfortable for a first meeting with my office. He had the particular confidence of someone who had been told too many times that he was charming and had started to rely on it. He shook my hand. He sat down. He looked at Genevieve. He looked at her the way I had watched men look at things they were deciding they wanted. That evaluating look that moved too slow and landed in the wrong places. And something in my chest went very quiet in a very loud way. She didn't notice. Or she noticed and handled it exactly the way she handled everything. Without reaction. Without invitation. Without giving it any more space than it deserved. She kept her eyes on the documents. She answered the questions directed at her with clean, factual precision. Carter leaned toward her to look at the border map she was holding. I repositioned. I moved from my side of the desk to the space directly beside her, casually, like I had simply needed a better angle on the map. I did not look at Carter while I did it. I looked at the map, but I was between them. The meeting ended 12 minutes early. I ended it. Carter left looking like he wasn't sure what had happened, which was the correct way for him to leave. Genevieve waited until the door closed. Then, she set the map down on the desk and smoothed it with both hands and said, to the map rather than to me, "You moved. I needed to see the borderline." She didn't believe me. She wasn't saying she didn't believe me. She was just not pretending she did. I looked at the side of her face. She looked at the map. "She works for me," I said. She glanced up. "I'm right here." "I know." Another pause. "I know," I said again, quieter. And this time, it didn't sound like what I'd meant it to sound like. This time it sounded like something else entirely. She looked back at the map. I looked at her, and my wolf, which had been patient and watching and waiting the way wolves wait, with the specific, terrible patience of something that has already decided the outcome and is simply allowing time to catch up, settled, like it had heard something it had been listening for, like it had finally, after 7 years of silence, gotten an answer it recognized. And that should have alarmed me. It alarmed me, but I stayed exactly where I was, standing beside her at the desk, not moving away, not moving closer, just there, present in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be present in front of another person in longer than I could cleanly remember. And when she finally gathered the documents and stood and said goodnight and walked out of the study, I sat down in the chair she had just left. It was still warm. I put my hands flat on the desk. I stared at the wall for a long time, and my wolf did not pace, did not push, did not do any of the things it did when it wanted something I wouldn't give it. It sat, quiet, content, like it already knew something I hadn't admitted yet, like it was waiting for me to catch up. I had made a mistake. Not the gala invitation that came later, and that was a different kind of mistake in a different category entirely. The mistake I'm talking about happened 3 days before the gala, on a Tuesday evening in the main corridor outside the East Library, and it happened like this. She was carrying a stack of bound correspondence, thick volumes, heavier than they looked, and she had too many of them. She always took on more than was reasonable. That was simply who she was, and the top 3 shifted on the turn, and she caught them, but the momentum put her sideways into the corridor wall, and she hit it with her shoulder and made a sound she immediately shut down. That small, compressed exhale of pain that a person makes when they're trying to make sure no one hears them hurting. I heard it. I was 12 feet behind her. I had been coming from the North Study, and she hadn't known I was there. And she recovered in under a second, books restacked, posture straight, pace resumed like it hadn't happened, like she'd already decided it didn't count. I caught up to her in 3 strides. "Give me half of those." She turned, saw it was me. Her expression did the thing it always did when I came up on her without warning, that fast sequence of processing. The almost startled look she corrected before it fully arrived, the settling that came after. "I have them," she said. "You hit the wall." I recovered. "Give me half." She looked at me for a moment, not refusing, not complying, just looking in that particular way she had, like she was deciding whether the situation warranted the argument or whether the argument was more trouble than it was worth. She held out half the stack. I took them. We walked down the corridor side by side, and that specific, ordinary, accidental thing was the mistake, because it was too easy. The walking beside her, the weight of the books in my hands, the fact that she matched my pace without adjusting for it. She just naturally fell into the same rhythm. And the corridor was quiet, and the torches were low, and for approximately 60 seconds, we were not a king and a contract servant. We were just 2 people walking down a hall, sharing a load. My wolf noticed. My wolf catalogued it and held it and turned it over and decided this was exactly what it wanted more of. And when I felt that happen, when I felt the want clarify and settle and point in her direction with that absolute wolfish certainty that I had not felt since before everything fell apart, I handed her back the books when we reached the library. She took them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't carry more than you can manage," I said. Her mouth curved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. Like she found something quietly funny and was choosing not to share it. I walked back to my study. I sat at my desk. I thought about the gala. The Northern Summit had been on the calendar for 3 months. 12 pack leaders, their seconds, their representatives. A formal showing of strength and unity in my house, the kind of event that was less about the politics discussed over dinner and more about who sat where and who entered with whom and what every deliberate, visible choice communicated to everyone watching. I had not brought anyone to this event in 7 years. That was its own communication. It said, "I am singular. I am sufficient. I do not need to show you anything soft to demonstrate that I am strong." And it had served me well. It had kept a clean line around me that nobody tested, because testing the Alpha King's personal life was not a miscalculation anyone made twice. Except that Marcus had briefed me this morning on which delegates were attending, and in that list brought as guests of the Alderton family, a minor affiliated pack in the southern foothills, were the names Cassidy and Bryn Cole, her sisters, who had stood in a doorway and watched a contract get signed that sent Genevieve 200 miles north to a life they had chosen not to take in her place. I closed the brief. I thought about it for exactly long enough, and then I called Harlan. I told her to have the blue guest gown from the 3rd floor wardrobe fitted for Genevieve. I told her to have it done by the following evening. I told her that Genevieve Cole would be attending the summit as my personal guest. Harlan did not react. Harlan never reacted. But there was a pause of approximately 1 second before she said, "Of course, just 1 second." Just enough to tell me that she had heard what I said and understood what it meant and was filing it in the category of things that were happening now. Whether or not they were expected, I didn't tell Genevieve until the morning of. I walked into the study. She was already at her desk, already reading. She looked up. "You're attending the summit tonight," I said. "A beat. As staff? As my guest." She set the document down. She looked at me with those eyes that read everything and gave nothing away until she decided to give it, and I watched her process the information, what it meant, what it cost, what I was doing, and possibly why, and I held her gaze and did not look away. "All right," she said. That was it. "All right." She went back to the document. I stood there for a moment, longer than I needed to, then went to my desk. That evening, I was waiting in the main entry when she came down the stairs. The blue dress was not quite right, the sleeves slightly long, the fit not exactly what it should have been, because we'd had 20 hours and the seamstress had done what she could. It didn't matter. She came down those stairs with her chin level and her shoulders square, and the particular posture of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to walk into rooms where she didn't belong and make the room question whether it was the room that was wrong. I offered my arm. She took it. Her fingers were very light on my sleeve, barely there, like she was touching something that might be fragile and hadn't decided how to handle it yet. I covered them with my hand, light. My palm over her fingers, just steady. She glanced at me sideways. I looked forward. We walked in. The room turned. Of course, it turned. I had known it would turn. I had chosen to bring her here, knowing exactly what the room would do. And I had made that choice anyway. And I was watching it happen. The recognition ripple, the whisper current, the recalibration of assumptions moving through 12 delegations like a wind through standing wheat, and I kept my hand on hers and kept us walking and let the room adjust. She held perfectly still under all of it. That was what I noticed. Not that she was nervous, she was. I could feel the slight tension in her fingers, but that she did not let the nervousness show. She moved through that room the way she moved through everything. Contained, deliberate, present. Like she had decided that, whatever this cost her, she was going to pay it, standing upright. She was extraordinary. I had known that in the corridor. The first morning. I had known it in the West Wing. I had known it in every day of the 2 weeks since, watching her work and think and recover and carry more than was fair without once asking anyone to notice. But seeing her in that room, holding her ground under the weight of 200 eyes, deciding what she was, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand yet. I was not bringing her here to make a point. I was not bringing her here as strategy. I was bringing her here because I wanted her here. Because I wanted to stand next to her in the one room in my world where everything I was became visible. And I wanted her in that picture. That understanding arrived calmly. It didn't shake me the way I expected it to. It settled, like the wolf an hour earlier. Like something coming home. And then I saw Cassidy Cole. She was standing with the Alderton group, 20 feet away, holding a drink and wearing the kind of dress that announced its own cost. She had seen us before I saw her. I caught the moment her expression moved from social neutral to something more complex. A flash of recognition and recalibration so fast that most people would have missed it. Genevieve saw her a half-second later. I felt it in her fingers. The almost invisible tightening. The single, small breath she took and controlled before it could mean anything. Cassidy moved toward us. She was smiling. It was the kind of smile that was technically a smile and functioned as something else entirely. Genevieve. Warm. Light. Knives in the vowels. "I didn't know you'd be here." Cassidy. Genevieve's voice was pleasant. Level. She had spent 22 years in rooms with these people. She knew how this worked. "You look well." Cassidy's eyes moved to me, recalibrating again. "I see you've settled in." "I have." The sister leaned in slightly, not toward me, toward Genevieve, with the specific ease of someone used to making others feel small by getting close. "Serving at a summit gala. That's very adaptive." She said adaptive like it was a consolation. I moved my hand from Genevieve's fingers to her waist. Deliberate, firm. The sister's eyes dropped to my hand. "She's not here as staff," I said. I said it to Cassidy. But I said it to the 6 people standing within earshot, and to the 8 more who had drifted close, because that is what rooms do when something real is happening, they fill in. She's here as my guest. Cassidy's smile stayed perfectly in place. It cost her. I could see it costing her. I turned to Genevieve. I took her hand, her right hand, both of my hands around it, and I brought it up and pressed my mouth to her knuckles. Not a performance. Not a maneuver. I did it because I wanted to. I looked at her while I did it. Not at the room, not at the sister, at Genevieve, at the slight part of her lips, at the way something moved across her eyes, surprise, and then something behind the surprise that was older and quieter and looked a great deal like the thing she was afraid to name. I held that look for 3 full seconds. Then I released her hand. "Come," I said quietly. We walked further into the room. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, under her breath, low enough for only me, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. We walked on, and she didn't pull away from my hand at her waist. She walked with me, through the room, through the summit, through every set of eyes and every recalibrating assumption and every silent question being asked about who she was and what she meant. She held her chin level. She held her ground. And I held her hand at the end of the evening. After the delegates had moved to the dining room, and the corridor outside was empty and the torches were burning low, and I stopped walking. She stopped beside me. I looked at her. Really looked. The borrowed dress. The hair that had come slightly loose over the evening. The one earring that was angled wrong and had been angled wrong since before dinner. The face that was tired and composed, and underneath the composure uncertain in a way she would not have wanted me to see. I saw it anyway. "You should have been at that table your whole life," I said. She blinked. It was the only thing she did. "Go get some rest," I said. She looked at me for one more moment. Then she walked down the corridor toward the east wing, and I stood in that empty corridor and watched her go, and my wolf pressed its whole weight against the inside of my chest. Not urgently, not desperately, just insistently, like it was done being patient, like the time for waiting was ending, and like everything that came next was going to change both of us in ways we couldn't walk back from. I was right about that. I just didn't know yet how right. 3 hours later, a scout came to my door. Rogue movement. Eastern border. Too many. Too organized. Moving in a pattern that had a shape I recognized. Not random. Not opportunistic. Coordinated. Someone had pointed them at us. And as I stood at my war table at midnight, reading the scout report, one thought moved through everything else like a blade. They were coming from the direction of the mill. The same mill where the water gate sat open. The same mill that only one person in my household had inventoried last week. The same person who had just spent an evening in the middle of my world, visible to every delegation, every enemy, every set of eyes that wanted leverage over me. I had just put a target on her back, and the wolves were already moving.
The kiss happened at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, and neither of them planned it. That was the part Genevieve would never be able to explain cleanly, not to herself, not to anyone, because in every version of the story she could have imagined, before walking through those iron gates, the moment a man like Dominic Vale closed the distance between them was supposed to feel like a surrender, like something being taken, like the natural, inevitable conclusion of a power imbalance that had never pretended to be anything else. It didn't feel like any of that. It felt like a question. She had gone to him. That was the part she owned. She had found out about Null blood from the old housekeeper 3 days after the gala, had sat with it for 72 hours. He had turned it over in the dark every night, while the fire burned in her room, and the estate settled into its late-hour quiet. And then she had knocked on the door of his study at 11:42 and walked in before he answered. He was at his desk, shirt sleeves, papers in hand. The look of a man who had been working for hours and had stopped noticing. He saw her and set the papers down, and his expression did the thing she had learned to read by now, the fast, careful settling, the thing he did instead of reacting. "You found out," he said. Not a question. He'd known it was coming. "Tell me what it means," she said. "All of it. Not the version that makes it easier. The real one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. He walked around the desk, and he stopped in front of her, and he told her, "Null blood." The way it hit a wolf's bond signal, differently, louder, cleaner, like a frequency with no static. The way it had nothing to do with choice, and everything to do with something older than either of them. The way he had felt it the first morning in the corridor. The way his wolf had recognized her before his mind had finished forming a thought. He told her the truth. He stood in front of her and told her the truth, in a voice that was stripped of everything except the words themselves. No armor, no management, no carefully controlled affect, just his voice, saying real things in the quiet of the study, while the fire burned low in the grate behind him. And when he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. "So the fires," she said. "The food, the gala." "Yes, that was the bond." He held her gaze. "Some of it was the bond," he said. "The rest was me." That was when it happened. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of grand sweeping motion that belongs to other kinds of stories. He raised one hand to her face, slow enough that she could have stepped back, slow enough that every fraction of the movement asked permission, and his thumb brushed her cheekbone. Memorizing. That was what it felt like he was learning the shape of her face the way you learn something you're terrified of forgetting. She didn't breathe. He kissed her. Soft, certain. The kiss of a man who had decided, finally, after a very long time of not allowing himself to decide anything, and that decision was in every part of it. The steadiness, the restraint, the specific tenderness of someone who understood exactly what they were holding and refused to be careless with it. She kissed him back. She hadn't decided to. Her body simply responded to him the way it had been quietly responding to him for weeks, without her permission, without her logic, without any of the careful frameworks she had built to keep herself from wanting things she wasn't supposed to have. He pulled back first. He always pulled back first. That was who he was. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire crackled. "There are things," he said quietly, "that make this complicated." "There are always things," she said. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, he didn't smile. Not yet, but the beginning of something that could, under different circumstances, become one. "You're not afraid of complicated," he said. "I survived my family," she said. "Complicated is a step up." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "There's something you need to know about the rogues." And the room temperature dropped. Not physically, but something in his face changed the brief warmth that had been there, carefully contained but real, pulled back behind something harder and older and worried in a way she had never seen on him before. Her stomach tightened. "What rogues?" she said. He crossed to the desk. He picked up the scout report she hadn't noticed when she'd walked in. He held it out to her. She read it. Her hands went still halfway down the first page. Eastern border. Coordinated movement. 40 wolves minimum. A pattern with a shape. And at the bottom, circled in his handwriting, the mill. The Watergate. Her inventory notes cited as the source on the strategic vulnerability. She looked up. "Someone accessed your inventory report," he said. "Someone in this estate. Someone who knew you'd cataloged the gate mechanism." The silence in the room changed. She put the report back on the desk. She thought of Cassidy at the gala, the way she'd looked at Dominic, the way her eyes had moved too quickly to the hand at Genevieve's waist, cataloging, calculating, the specific expression of someone who had just realized that a situation they had written off was not written off at all. She thought of Bryn, who had left the room before the contract was signed. She thought of the Alderton family, who had brought them both here. "You think someone at the summit gave them the information," she said. "I think someone knew exactly where to find it," he said. "And I think they moved within 48 hours of the gala." She held very still. "They're not coming for the territory," she said. "No," he said. He looked at her. "They're coming for leverage," he said. "One beat. They're coming for you." She did not let herself react. She breathed through it. She kept her face level. She was very good at this, at receiving information that could unravel her and holding it together by sheer will until she had a moment to process it alone. But her hands, flat on the desk where she'd set the report, her hands were not entirely steady. He saw it. He crossed to her. He put his hands over hers. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said. "Not a performance. Not a king making a declaration. A man making a promise." The difference was in the voice lower, more stripped, more real than anything official. She looked up at him. "I know," she said. She meant it. Which was the strangest part of all of it, she realized. Standing there in the study at midnight, with a rogue attack incoming, and her sister's fingerprints, possibly on the intelligence leak, and everything she had survived in the last 3 weeks, still raw and unresolved. The strangest. The part was that she believed him. She believed him absolutely. She trusted a man she had known for 3 weeks in a way she had never trusted the family she'd lived with for 22 years. And somehow, impossibly, that didn't surprise her at all. The rogues hit the eastern perimeter at 4:23 in the morning. Not a warning, not a probe. They came in fast and in numbers, and with the particular organization of wolves who had been briefed on the layout, which entry points were guarded, which patrol routes had gaps, which structures were secondary enough to approach without triggering the inner alarm system. Dominic had already repositioned before the first howl sounded. He'd been awake. He was always awake before attacks, now something in his wolf that had recalibrated since Genevieve arrived. More alert, more attuned, operating at a frequency he hadn't had access to in years. He had his second, Marcus, running the inner perimeter. He had 3 teams on the outer wall. He had already sent 2 wolves to the east corridor to stand outside her door without telling her they were coming, because she would have argued, and he didn't have time for that argument. He had also told himself, very firmly, that he would send her to the vault corridor. He had not accounted for the fact that Genevieve Cole would be standing in the main hall when he got there, already dressed, already awake, already holding the inventory ledger open to the page with the mill diagram. He stopped walking. "Go back to your room," he said. "The Watergate," she said. She turned the ledger toward him. "If they know the layout, this is where they'll push hardest. The gate mechanism hasn't been serviced in 2 years. The lock chain is corroded on the left side. I noted it, but it wasn't flagged as urgent. If 40 wolves hit that gate, it fails." He looked at the diagram. He looked at her. "I know the mechanism," she said. "I was the last person to physically touch it. I can close it and secure it before they reach it, if you give me 3 of your wolves in 4 minutes." The alarm was sounding now. Low, resonant, the deep frequency pulse that moved through the estate's stone walls like a heartbeat. Around him, his wolves were moving efficient and focused, trained and ready, the kind of coordination that came from years of trust and clear command structure. He looked at Genevieve. She looked back at him. She was afraid. He could see it, not the paralyzed kind, the clarified kind, the fear that moves through a person and leaves them sharper on the other side. Her jaw was set, her eyes were level. She was holding the ledger like a weapon. 3 wolves, he said. You take the south path, it's 60 seconds faster. You do not engage directly with any rogue. You get to the gate, you close it, and you get clear of the structure. Do you understand? Yes. If anything goes wrong, close the gate, she said. Then come find me. She did not wait for his response. She turned and moved toward the south passage, and he stood there for 1 second. 1 second where everything in him wanted to follow her, to put himself between her and every single thing moving in the dark outside these walls. And then he shifted. He hit the outer ground running. The eastern perimeter was already engaged. 3 rogues had breached the first wall. His wolves met them at the tree line. The sounds of the fight were somewhere between human and not. The particular violence of shifted wolves who were not holding anything back. He moved through it and past it, heading for the bulk of the coordinated force which his wolf could feel moving in a curved line toward the southeast. Toward the mill. He ran faster. The mill sat at the edge of the estate's southern boundary, old stone, water wheel, the gate mechanism built into the lower level where the stream ran through. By the time he came over the ridge, Genevieve and her 3 wolves were already inside the outer wall of the mill structure. 2 rogues were in the yard. His wolves took them. He came through the gate in time to see Genevieve at the mechanism, both hands on the main wheel, her whole body committed to turning it. The corroded chain on the left side was fighting her. She'd lost it once, caught it, was going again. She was not making a sound. Her teeth were clenched, and her shoulders were shaking, and she was turning that wheel with everything she had. The gate slammed shut. The sound was enormous. Metal on stone, a deep, resonant clang that moved through the ground. On the other side of it, something shifted in the rogue formation. He felt the pattern break, the coordination fracture, the loss of their target route registering like a pulse disruption through the whole group. And then the rogues redirected. Toward the mill. Toward her. He shifted before the thought finished forming. He came through the mill wall. Not the door. The wall. The stone gave way like it was paper, which was what happened when a full shifted alpha wolf decided a wall was not a sufficient obstacle, and he hit the yard on the other side of it, in the full massive black form of his wolf. And there were 6 rogues between him and the gate, and he didn't think about it. He moved through them. Not for territory. Not for pack law. Not for any of the reasons he had ever fought before. This woman walked through his gate on a cart, with a broken bag, and a name she'd signed on a contract she hadn't deserved. He fought for her. He fought the way his wolf had been waiting 7 years to fight for something with total commitment, with absolute presence, with the specific, terrible focus of a creature that has identified the one thing it cannot afford to lose, and is removing every obstacle between itself and that thing. It was over in under 4 minutes. The remaining rogues broke and ran. That was what rogues did when the alpha they were assigned to provoke proved to be significantly more than whoever sent them had assessed. They ran. He shifted back. He crossed the mill yard in 5 strides. She was against the gate mechanism, upright, her hands braced behind her on the iron wheel. There was dust on her face, and her sleeve was torn at the shoulder, and she was breathing hard, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before. Open, unguarded, every careful layer she maintained, stripped away by adrenaline and exhaustion, and the specific rawness of the last 10 minutes. He reached her. He took her face in both hands. He checked her. Eyes, neck, the torn shoulder, her hands, checking with the methodical urgency of someone who needed the information more than they needed to appear calm about needing it. "I'm fine," she said, steady. She was already steadying. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He kept his hands on her face for a moment longer than checking required. She let him. Then, in a voice that came from somewhere below strategy and control and 7 years of keeping himself at a safe distance from everything that mattered, in a voice that was just him, just the most essential and undefended part of him, he said it. "Mine." 1 word. Not a demand, not a declaration of property. A recognition. The word a wolf uses when it has finally, after a very long time, found the thing that belongs beside it. She looked at him. The mill yard was quiet. Dawn was pushing gray light over the tree line. His wolves were at the perimeter. The estate was settling. She put her hand over his, the one still cupped against her face. She pressed it there, and she said, "Yes." Just that. Just, yes. Like it was simple. Like it had always been simple, and they had simply needed to get through everything else first to reach it. He pressed his forehead to hers. The wolf in him, the thing that had been patient and relentless and absolutely certain from the first morning in the corridor, settled completely, like it had finally exhaled. But there was still one thing unresolved. One thing that had been pressing against the edges of everything since the scout report. Someone inside the estate had leaked the inventory notes. Someone had accessed that document and handed it to enemies who had used it to build an attack plan specifically designed to use Genevieve as leverage against him. Someone who had been at the gala. Someone who had seen exactly what she meant to him. He lifted his head. His jaw was tight. "We need to go back," he said quietly. She read his face. She nodded. They walked back through the gray dawn with her hand in his, and his wolves flanking them on either side, and the estate rising ahead of them out of the early morning dark. And he already knew who it was. He had known since the gala. He just needed Genevieve not to be in the room when he dealt with it. Because what he was about to do was not something she needed to see. It was Bryn, the younger sister. The one who had left the room before the contract was signed, which Genevieve had always read as guilt. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. She had left the room because she had already made a different arrangement, one that predated the contract, one that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to become useful. The Alderton family was not a minor-affiliated pack. That was the cover. What they actually were was a network 7 families across 4 territories, connected by debt and loyalty to a pack leader in the Northern Disputed Zone, who had been building a case for challenging Dominic's sovereignty for 3 years. The challenge needed leverage. Leverage required proximity. Proximity required someone inside the estate. Bryn Cole had been that someone. She had attended the gala with one job: confirm whether Genevieve had become significant to the Alpha King. If the answer was yes, the asset could be activated. If the answer was no, the plan went dormant. The answer, after the knuckle kiss and the public positioning and the very visible hand at Genevieve's waist, had been a clear and resounding yes. She had accessed the inventory report through Cassidy, who had distracted the assistant's desk long enough for Bryn to copy the relevant pages. The information was out within 2 hours of the gala ending. Marcus laid all of this out in the war room at 7 in the morning, while Genevieve stood very still and listened to the architecture of what her family had built. She did not cry. Of course she didn't cry. Genevieve Cole had cried about her family somewhere private, alone, years ago, had cried through the necklace and the hand-me-downs and the 10,000 quiet meals and the contract signed at the kitchen table. She had already done that work. She had already paid that price. What she felt now was something different, cleaner, colder. "Where is she?" Genevieve asked. "Detained," Marcus said. He glanced at Dominic. Dominic had not moved from his position at the head of the war table since Marcus began the briefing. He was in the particular stillness he occupied when he was deciding something not cold, not distant, but collected in a way that was more intense than anger, because it was quieter. "Cassidy," Genevieve said. "She's in a guest room under escort," Marcus said. "We don't believe she knew the full scope. She was used." Genevieve absorbed that. She turned it over. She thought of Cassidy at the gala, the smile with the knives in it, the adaptive comment, the flash of genuine surprise when she saw Dominic's hand at Genevieve's waist. Cassidy had spent 22 years competing with her without being aware there was a competition. She had been cruel in the way of people who don't know they're being cruel, because they've never had to think about the person on the other end of it. But she had not sold her sister to enemy wolves. Bryn had. "I want to see her," Genevieve said. Dominic spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Genevieve, she's my sister," she said. "I want to see her." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded to Marcus. The room they brought Bryn to was one of the small meeting rooms off the north corridor. She was seated at the table, not restrained, just watched. 2 of Dominic's wolves at the door, and 1 at the window. She looked smaller than she had at the gala. Younger. Some of the confidence had gone out of her posture, leaving behind the girl Genevieve had grown up beside younger by 3 years, always watching, always measuring, always trying to find the angle. Genevieve sat across from her. She didn't speak right away. Neither did Bryn. The room was very quiet. "You knew they weren't going to take the territory," Genevieve said finally. You knew what they actually wanted. Bryn looked at the table. How long? Genevieve said. It doesn't. How long, Bryn? A pause. 8 months, Bryn said. Quiet. Before the contract. I'd already been in contact with the Alderton family for 8 months when Dad brought home the papers. 8 months. Genevieve let that settle. You suggested me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Bryn's jaw moved. That was the answer. The contract had not come to her family at random. The Alderton family had guided it there. And Bryn, 20 years old, watching her sister fold laundry, while her own life felt small and airless, and going nowhere, had seen an opportunity and taken it. What were they going to give you? Genevieve said. A place, Bryn said. Her voice cracked on the word, just slightly, with the Alderton pack. A real place. Not this. Not Dad's house and his moods and Cassidy's hand-me-down everything. I wanted... She stopped. She looked up, and Genevieve saw it then, not the calculation, not the plan, but under it, the thing the plan had been built to cover. A girl who felt as invisible as she did. A girl who had looked at the same family table and seen the same absence and made a different, worse choice about what to do with it. Genevieve felt something move through her chest that she hadn't expected. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not completely. But it was understanding. And understanding and forgiveness were not the same thing. But understanding was where you had to start if you were ever going to get somewhere honest. She stood up. I can't fix this for you, she said. What happens next is between you and him. She meant Dominic. Bryn knew she meant Dominic. But I want you to know one thing. Bryn looked at her. You didn't have to do it this way, Genevieve said. You could have just left. She walked out of the room. Dominic was in the corridor outside, leaning against the stone wall, arms crossed, waiting. He had not been in the room. He had given her that. She stopped beside him. She leaned back against the wall. They stood side by side in the corridor for a quiet moment. She'll be remanded to the Pack Council, he said. Given her age, and the fact that she didn't directly participate in the attack, the sentence will likely be supervised exile. 5 years. Supervised. Genevieve nodded. And Cassidy? Released today. The Alderton family's relationship with my territory is finished. Every affiliated arrangement is dissolved. She nodded again. She looked at the wall across from her. She thought about 8 months. She thought about a contract. She thought about a cart with a wooden bench and a blanket too thin for the cold. Dominic, she said. He looked at her. If none of this had happened, she said, if there had been no Alderton family, no arrangement, if my father had just legitimately needed someone to take a servant position, and I'd signed that contract on my own, and come here on my own, and none of it had been a setup. She paused. She turned her head to look at him. Would it have ended up here anyway? He held her gaze. He took a moment not to decide the answer. She could see that. To decide how much of the answer to say. Yes, he said. Just that. She let out a slow breath. And for the first time since she had arrived in this estate, since the cart and the cold and the gate, and the room with the unlit fireplace, and every single day of careful, deliberate survival, she felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't realized was knotted. Something she had been holding together by will for longer than she could measure. She let it go. She turned and walked back toward the east wing, and Dominic watched her go. And he was already thinking about what came next. 6 months later, the estate was different, not in structure. The walls were the same black granite. The towers still disappeared into the low northern cloud. The gates still opened in that silent, certain way that said they had never failed to know who was supposed to pass through them. But the feeling inside it was different. The staff noticed first. They noticed the way the household moved looser, somehow, less like machinery and more like something alive. Morning briefings started 10 minutes earlier, because the Alpha King's assistant had reorganized the schedule for efficiency. The correspondence backlog was perpetually clear. The estate's administrative systems, which had been functional but rigid for years, had been quietly, thoroughly rebuilt. What the staff talked about, in the particular understated way of people who work in the orbit of power and know better than to be obvious about what they observe, was the sound. There was occasionally, and this was new, the sound of voices, not formal communication, not orders and confirmations, and the transactional language that had been the only kind that moved through these halls for 7 years. Voices. 2 of them. From behind the closed door of the study adjacent to his office. Sometimes it was professional, she was reading correspondence aloud, or working through an administrative problem with him. Sometimes it was something else. Sometimes there was a pause where you could tell something had been said that warranted a silence. Sometimes, rarely, so rarely that the staff had learned not to react when they heard it for fear of breaking the spell. He laughed. The first time it happened, Mrs. Harlan had stopped walking in the corridor outside and put her hand against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. She had worked in this estate for 11 years. She had never heard that sound. Inside the study, Genevieve was aware of none of this. She was reading a report on the Northwestern Territorial Adjustment, and she had said something she couldn't even remember what. Something about the logic of the boundary line being designed by someone who had never actually looked at the terrain, and he had made the sound. Quiet and low and real and completely unguarded. She had looked up. He was looking at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in the early weeks with all that controlled attention, all that carefully managed watching. This look was different. Open. The look of a man who had stopped managing himself around a specific person because managing himself around her had become The ceremony was small. That had been her condition. Not a demand. She wasn't built for demands. She was built for direct conversation, which was different, but she had said, clearly and once, that if this was going to happen, she wanted it to be real and not a performance. And real meant the people who mattered and not the politics. He had agreed without hesitation. 31 people in the great hall of the estate on a clear Saturday morning in January. Marcus, Mrs. Harlan, who had cried exactly once, and in private, and would deny it forever. The core of the pack, his wolves, the people who had run with him through everything, who had stood at every perimeter and held every line and known him in all the ways that counted before anything else did. The pack elder who performed the bonding, old and white-haired and unsurprised by any of it, as though he had been waiting for this specific morning since the first day Dominic Vail had taken the alpha title. And Cassidy. Genevieve had called her. 3 weeks after the incident, 2 months after the gala, on a Sunday afternoon when she had sat down with a phone in her hand and thought about the difference between what people deserved and what you chose to offer anyway. Cassidy had answered on the second ring. The conversation had been short and honest and difficult in the way of conversations that acknowledge real things between people who had never quite allowed themselves to. "I didn't know about Bryn," Cassidy said. And then, before Genevieve could respond, "I should have." That was all either of them needed it to be. She stood in the back now, in a green dress, and she held it together until the elder's final words, and then she didn't, and nobody held that against her. Genevieve wore the blue dress, the one from the gala, the one that hadn't been quite right, except that Harlan had had it properly fitted 3 weeks ago, and now it was right. The sleeves, the correct length, the waist exactly as it should be, every alteration made with care. She walked into the great hall without ceremony. No music, no processional. She simply walked in the blue dress, with her hair down and her chin level. And Dominic was standing at the front of the room in the cleanest, the simplest version of his dark coat, and he looked up when she walked in, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first morning in the corridor, with his full, complete, absolute attention, except that now it wasn't careful, now it wasn't managed. Now it was just him, looking at her, and he wasn't trying to hide any part of what the looking meant. She walked to him. The elder spoke. The old words older than the estate, older than the pack, older than anything except the bond itself, which was older than all of it, and had known what it was doing that morning in the corridor before either of them had the context to understand it. Dominic took her hands. He held them the way he held everything that mattered to him, not tight, not constraining, but steady, firmly present. The hold of someone who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. She looked up at him. He looked at her, and she felt it, not the ceremony, not the words, not even the warmth of the room around them. She felt the thing itself, the bond, full and clear and clean, the frequency she had learned the name of and which had existed, apparently, since the moment she stepped out of that cart and the gate closed behind her, and something in the land had looked at her and started deciding. It felt like recognition. It felt like the answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. It felt like enough. The elder finished speaking. Dominic raised her hands. He pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the same gesture as the gala, except that this time he was looking at her instead of the room, and the room was looking at them with something that was unmistakably love, not for a king making a political statement, not for a story that had a clean lesson, but for two people who had found each other by the most improbable route possible and had held on anyway. Marcus cleared his throat in the particular way he used to cover emotion he wasn't going to acknowledge. Mrs. Harlan, in the back, looked at the ceiling. Cassidy pressed her hand over her mouth. Genevieve, who had signed a contract at a kitchen table 6 months ago and been sent north in a cart to a life she hadn't chosen, stood in the great hall of the estate that had become home, and looked at the man who had lit her fireplace before he knew her name and felt, somewhere in the deepest and most essential part of herself, chosen, not given away, not written off, not the thing people discarded when they needed something easier. Chosen. By him. Deliberately. Over and over. In every small and enormous way: the fire, the food, the corridor, the gala, the tower window, the 31 people in this room on a Saturday morning. Chosen. And she let it be true. She let it fill up the places that her family's carelessness had emptied. She let it sit in the space that all the hand-me-downs and kitchen table silences and unsigned glances had left behind. She let it be hers, because she had survived everything else. And this good, real, solid, improbable thing she was going to let herself keep. Outside the estate, The mountain range sat white and still against the January sky. The gate stood open, not in urgency, not because something was incoming or outgoing or needed managing, just open, the way things open when they're no longer keeping anything out, the way things open when they're simply home. She didn't just survive the Alpha King. She became the only thing he could never live without, and he became the first person who had ever made her feel like she was worth the staying. That's the end of this story. But if this hit you somewhere real, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those chapters, if you know what it feels like to be the one who gets handed the contract instead of offered the choice, I want you to know that this channel exists for exactly that, for the stories where the overlooked girl gets the ending she deserved all along. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if you want to see more stories like this one, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new story when it drops. Every week we bring you a new world, a new bond, a new woman who finds out what she's actually worth. And I want you here for all of it. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it the West Wing? The gala? The tower window? Tell me in the comments and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Your share might be the thing that reaches somebody who needs a reminder that overlooked doesn't mean unworthy. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.